Hello, this is the first in a series of 3 mini lecture recordings for the anterior abdominal wall and various other awesome stuff. The objectives for all 3 of these mini lectures are listed here, but in this first mini lecture we're going to be talking specifically about the objective in orange. Alright, so we'll go through that. The objectives that are listed in blue are self-directed objectives, and if you go to ECA, there'd be a nice simple explanation of both of those, so just please check that out. Alright, so layers of the muscles of the abdominal wall, general blood supply, innervation, and function. So starting with blood supply, 3 major blood supplies to the anterior abdominal wall, and those are listed here. In yellow, the intercostal arteries, which are running in the intercostal or the costal groove, are going to extend from the ribs toward the lateral abdominal wall to supply that region. In blue, we have the superior epigastric artery, which is an extension from the internal thoracic artery above. And then we have the inferior epigastric artery in purple, which is off of the external iliac artery from below and extending upwards. So the epigastrics are supplying the midline of the abdomen, and the intercostals are from 11 to 12 are supplying the lateral abdominal wall. There are other arteries, but that's sort of the main. These are the main ones. All right, cutaneous innervation comes from T7 to L1 in this nice segmented pattern that you see here. From T7 to T11 are the thoraco-abdominal nerves, and they're called that because they're coming from the intercostal nerves. So that's where the thoraco comes from, and they're just going toward the abdominal wall. We also have some branches off the lumbar plexus, which we're going to learn about in the posterior abdominal wall, so I won't get into those into any detail, but again, you see a nice segmented pattern. The most important landmark is the umbilicus, which is located at the level of T10. Muscles of the abdominal wall are listed here. I've highlighted in red the things that are the most important, so just focus on those. When it comes to innervation, if you just know thoraco-abdominal nerves, that's good enough. All those other details are not really key. And just to go get a visual of those muscles of the abdominal wall, the rectus abdominis muscles are the muscles of your 6 or 8 pack that you'd see in somebody who's really quite defined. And the reason why you get that 6 or 8 pack is because of the tendinous intersections, which are these connective tissue breaks in the muscle. All right, and then the other layers on the lateral wall are the external oblique, internal oblique, and transverse abdominal, from most superficial external to deepest transverse abdominal. And they have the same orientation or similar orientation to your intercostal muscles, which you learned in thorax. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about these muscles. All right, the layers of the abdominal wall. When you look at the abdominal wall, you look at the lateral abdominal wall, which is highlighted in blue, and the medial portion of the abdominal wall, which is in red. So we're going to focus first on the blue or the lateral abdominal wall, and what are those layers? So if you look at the bottom right of the screen, you can see skin is highlighted as the first superficial layer. Underneath that is a subcutaneous fatty layer called Camper's fascia, and the way to remember that is, if you ever go camping and you want to sleep on a nice soft layer, that would be the Camper's fascia layer, that soft fatty layer. Underneath that is the Scarpa's fascia, which is just a very thin connective tissue layer immediately under Camper's fascia. Underneath that, we get into the muscular layers of the lateral abdominal wall, and that's why I put up this insert so you can follow on either one. Just a note that every muscle is surrounded by a layer of fascia. Okay, so for the external oblique, you can see in the insert image, it's surrounded by a pink layer of fascia. Then we have the internal oblique surrounded by its fascia in purple, and then we have the transverse abdominal surrounded by its layer of fascia in green. So those are the muscular layers. Deep to the transverse abdominal muscle and its fascia is the transversalis fascia in yellow. Just a note, there's a difference between the transversalis fascia in yellow and the transverse abdominal fascia, which is the green. So just note that those are two very different things. Then the innermost layer is the parietal peritoneum in gray. So those are the layers of the lateral portion of the abdominal wall. Then we get into the anterior portion, or the medial portion of the anterior abdominal wall. Skin, Camper's fascia, Scarpa's fascia is the same, but then things change. And the first thing we see highlighted in blue is the anterior layer of the rectus sheath. The rectus sheath is this dense connective tissue layer that surrounds the rectus abdominis muscle. That's why it's called the rectus sheath. The anterior layer of the rectus sheath is formed by the aponeurosis of the external oblique muscle, and an aponeurosis is just the fusion of the posterior and anterior components of the external oblique fascia to form a really thick layer of connective tissue called an aponeurosis. So, anterior rectus sheath is made up of the aponeurosis of the external oblique muscle and the anterior portion of the internal oblique fascia. So you can see the internal oblique fascia in purple is splitting to go in front of the rectus abdominis and behind. And it's the anterior layer that goes in front and forms the anterior layer of the rectus sheath. Now, underneath the anterior layer of the rectus sheath is the rectus abdominis muscle. And then behind the rectus abdominis is the posterior layer of the rectus sheath, which is formed by the aponeurosis, the posterior component of the internal oblique fascia in purple, which is joining with the aponeurosis of the transverse abdominal muscle in green, and that forms the posterior rectus sheath. Underneath the posterior rectus sheath is the transversalis fascia in yellow, and then the deepest layer is the parietal peritoneum. Where the rectus sheath, the anterior and posterior rectus sheath, come toward the midline, they join to form a structure called the linea alba. So it's just the connective tissue of all these aponeuroses coming together to form this dense connective tissue called the linea alba. In between the rectus abdominis and our lateral abdominal wall muscles, we have a structure called the linea semilunaris, which is connective tissue between those muscles. So if you look at it in this image, the red line and arrows is the linea alba, and the blue is the linea semilunaris. All right, so we know that the posterior rectus sheath is made up of the posterior layer of the internal oblique and the transverse abdominis aponeurosis, so the purple and green behind the rectus abdominis muscle. Now, at a point just below the level of the umbilicus, the posterior rectus sheath is going to shift its course. And the fibers that make up that posterior rectus sheath are now going to go, so at this point just below the level of the umbilicus, they're going to go in front of the rectus abdominis muscle. And that shift is going to create a structure called the arcuate line. Okay? And the arcuate line is this physical line behind the rectus abdominis muscle created by this shift in the posterior rectus sheath. So that's what you can see in the difference between figure B and figure C. Above this arcuate line, which is just below the umbilicus, you have the posterior rectus sheath going behind the rectus abdominis. In figure C, below that arcuate line, you have all the fibers, all the aponeuroses going in front of the rectus sheath. And so you actually can see this physical shadow which is formed by the arcuate line on the anterior aspect of the anterior abdominal wall. And you're actually going to see this nicely in the lab. All right? So what you can see, the little blue arches are that arcuate line, where above that arcuate line there is a posterior rectus sheath highlighted in yellow. So it's thicker at that point, less translucent. Below the arcuate line you have the red arrows formed it's thinner, more translucent, because you have only the transversalis fascia and the parietal peritoneum covering the rectus abdominis on the posterior or the internal aspect. And so it's thinner and more translucent. All right, so that's the arcuate line. So just by way of review, we covered the blood supply, innervation to the abdominal wall, the muscles of the abdominal wall, layers of the abdominal wall, specifically focusing on the posterior and anterior rectus sheath, and how the arrangement of the posterior rectus sheath is forming the arcuate line.